There are stories that pretend to be simple, and then there are stories that only look simple until you stare long enough for the surface to crack. Silver Bullet belongs to the second kind. It begins with the familiar quiet of a small American town, porches glowing softly at dusk screen doors, creaking neighbors exchanging polite nods that hide far more than they reveal. It feels peaceful, almost comfortable. Yet beneath that calm exterior, something restless is moving, something that doesn't wait for shadows to grow before revealing its presence. Stephen King's tale was never meant to be just a creature hunt. It was built from the tension between innocence and denial, drawing attention to how fear grows quietly in places that insist they are safe. The film that emerged from this story carried traces of that intention, but also inherited scars from the chaos behind the camera, abandoned ideas, last-minute decisions, unspoken conflicts, and strange incidents that shaped the film more than any werewolf ever could. What audiences finally saw was only the visible layer of a project threaded with secrecy and compromise. Look closely at Silver Bullet and you'll feel those unseen forces lingering at the edges of nearly every scene. A shot that holds too long, a mood that shifts without cause, a detail that hints at a different version of the story waiting underneath. These moments aren't accidents. They are fragments of a film that was constantly changing shape, fighting to keep its identity as it was pulled in conflicting directions. What follows isn't just trivia or behind-the-scenes chatter. These are the hidden fractures, the discarded truths, and the strange shadows cast across the making of Silver Bullet. 1985. Here are 20 weird facts you didn't know. Fact 1. One of the earliest and most striking truths about Silver Bullet is that the film was never intended to feel as straightforward as the final cut suggests. Stephen King's initial drafts painted the town not as a backdrop, but as a character fractured, anxious, and quietly rotting long before the first death occurred. The werewolf was meant to be an intrusion, but not the origin of the fear. The town itself was already drowning in its own unspoken tensions. King envisioned a story where small glances between neighbors, hushed conversations at church, and late-night whispers carried more threat than any creature lurking in the woods. But as production unfolded, this darker psychological layer began slipping away. Producers grew uneasy with a script that leaned into moral ambiguity rather than clean heroism. They wanted a narrative that looked more like a traditional 80s monster film, clear dangers, clear victims, clear triumph. Scenes highlighting the quiet ugliness of the town were reduced or softened, and characters originally written with gray boundaries became more sympathetic. What survived was only the faint outline of the gloom King originally intended. Still, if you watch closely, you'll notice peculiar tonal fractures, moments when a character hesitates too long or when the town's silence seems heavier than the plot requires. These lingering shadows are the remnants of a version of Silver Bullet that wanted to show a community devouring itself from within. The monster on screen is terrifying, but the one the script first imagined was much harder to kill. Fact 2. The chaos behind Silver Bullet's production wasn't just an obstacle, it became a defining force that shaped the film's identity. From the moment cameras rolled, the creative team found themselves pulled in different directions. Some wanted a somber meditation on hidden sin. Others pushed for explosive, marketable action. And then there was Stephen King, who envisioned a story steeped in emotional conflict, with horrors rooted as much in human choices as in supernatural violence. These visions couldn't exist together without friction, and that friction bled into every part of the filmmaking process. Actors often received contradictory instructions within hours of each other. One take emphasized vulnerability, the next required sharp theatrical fear. The creature was sometimes shot as a tragic anomaly, other times as a blunt force predator. Even the tone of simple dialogue scenes shifted subtly across the shoot, creating an internal dissonance editors later struggled to reconcile. When the footage was assembled, those tensions didn't disappear, they crystallized. Certain scenes feel slightly detached from the ones around them, carrying emotional cues belonging to different versions of the film. But instead of smoothing out every inconsistency, the editor allowed some of them to remain, believing the unease they created suited the story's themes. The result is a film that feels unsettled by design, even though the design was born of conflict. Silver Bullet may not be a seamless narrative, but its uneven heartbeat became its most haunting truth. FACT 3. The werewolf suit, so often mocked by fans for its tame, almost domesticated appearance, was the product of a struggle far more complicated than simple design failure. Before settling on the final creature, the effects department attempted several radically different prototypes that pushed the limits of 1980s practical effects. Early sketches featured creatures with elongated limbs, twisted joints, and unsettling facial distortions meant to reflect the agony of transformation rather than the dominance of a predator. These designs weren't meant to be frightening in the traditional sense. They were meant to unsettle, to disturb, to evoke something caught forever between identities. But the reality of bringing such ambitious concepts to life proved brutal. Mechanical components refused to synchronize with the performer's movements. Facial rigs twitched unpredictably, sometimes locking into frozen grimaces. Limbs buckled under their own weight, sending the suit actors stumbling or collapsing mid-test. In one early trial, a performer fell so hard that the crew temporarily suspended creature experimentation until safety adjustments could be made. Producers grew impatient as time and money drained away. They demanded a version of the werewolf that could move reliably under pressure, even if it meant abandoning the more disturbing designs. The final creature, broad and bear-like, was born not from creative triumph, but from necessity, a compromise that ensured the film could continue shooting. Many fans later criticized the monster for lacking menace, unaware that beneath its simplicity lay the ruins of far more ambitious attempts. The creature we see isn't the Monster King imagined. It's the only one the production survived. FACT 4. One of the most ambitious ideas ever planned for Silver Bullet involved a chase sequence meant to redefine how moviegoers perceived the werewolf. The director envisioned a creature whose movements felt wrong in a way that bypassed logic, fast gliding, and almost predatory in silence, like a nightmare sliding through the frame. To achieve this, the effects team constructed a custom rig designed to pull the performer across the ground at unsettling speed. It was risky, expensive, and wildly inventive for a mid-budget horror film. On the first major test, everything unraveled instantly. The rig jerked forward with too much force, throwing the suit actor violently to the ground. The fall damaged the harness, bruised the performer, and sent shockwaves through the production. Repairs would take days, redesigning it would take longer, but the schedule was already fragile. Tension rose. The director fought to keep the concept alive, insisting it was essential to the creature's identity, while producers argued that every hour spent on the experiment was money disappearing into the dark. In the end, the rig was scrapped. The chase sequence devolved into a far simpler pursuit, functional, familiar, and devoid of the eerie elegance originally imagined. Even so, hints of the abandoned idea remained. A few lingering shots feel like they were meant for a different kind of monster, one that never quite made it out of the testing room. The most haunting movement in the film is the one you never get to see. FACT-5. One of Silver Bullet's most memorable moments of terror exists because the actor experiencing it wasn't prepared for what he would face. Corey Haim was praised for his natural vulnerability on screen, but during production he had grown accustomed to the final werewolf suit and no longer found it frightening. The director needed something raw and honest burst of panic that couldn't be coached or rehearsed. So he made a controversial decision. Hidden in the effects workshop was an early werewolf prototype, a design abandoned for being too grotesque and unstable. Its skin texture was uneven. Its jaw hung slightly off-center. One eye sat higher than the other, drifting unnervingly during movement. It looked less like a creature and more like a mistake that refused to stay dead. The director ordered the creature brought out without telling Haim. When the cameras rolled, the malformed head lunged into frame. Haim's reaction, his jolt backward, the crack in his voice, the wide, startled look in his eyes was pure, unfiltered fear. The director got exactly what he wanted. The crew, however, felt uneasy. Some argued it went too far, that startling a young actor with a distorted monster was a breach of trust. Still, the take stayed, and decades later, fans still praise the authenticity of that moment, unaware it was captured with a creature that was never meant to be seen by anyone. FACT-6. The emotional dynamic between Marty and Uncle Red in Silver Bullet feels warm and almost comforting on screen. But it wasn't always written that way. In Stephen King's original vision, Red was a deeply wounded man, someone haunted by regret, burdened by failure, and hiding behind humor to mask how much of his life had unraveled. His bond with Marty wasn't meant to be charming. It was meant to be a fragile exchange between two people clinging to each other because no one else understood them. Their relationship was supposed to carry the weight of shared loneliness. But one producer feared this version was too bleak. He believed audiences needed an emotional anchor, someone lovable, flawed in mild ways, and capable of stepping into the role of unlikely hero. Quietly, he pushed for rewrites that softened Red's darkness. Scenes in which the character confronted his guilt were removed. Moments that hinted at deeper damage were trimmed or excised entirely. The result was a more accessible Red, still troubled but far less haunted. Yet traces of the original character survive in subtle details, the way Red's jokes sometimes feel like armor. The seconds of silence before he reassures Marty, the flicker of something broken behind his eyes. These small cracks suggest the deeper version King intended a man standing at the edge of his own shadows. The Red who survived the rewrite became a hero. The Red who was written first might have been something far more tragic. FACT-7. The shift in directorial leadership on Silver Bullet has long been softened in official accounts described as a smooth transition dictated by scheduling needs. But for those who lived through the production, the truth felt far closer to a quiet collapse. From the very beginning, creative disagreements brewed between the director and the studio, each holding incompatible visions for the film's tone. The director wanted a slow-burning dread, a horror that seeped rather than struck. The producers wanted urgency spectacle and an easily marketable monster. The breaking point surfaced during a demanding night shoot that required intricate lighting, thick fog, and precise blocking. After multiple takes, the director insisted on reshooting from scratch, claiming the atmosphere didn't breathe right. Producers saw only wasted hours and rising costs. Arguments intensified. Crew members noticed hushed conversations at the edge of the set. One assistant recalled a producer muttering that the film couldn't survive this kind of perfection. Days later, without ceremony, the director was gone. What he left behind were scenes that still bear a distinct visual fingerprint, steady frames, heavy pauses, and a kind of quiet tension that doesn't match the brisker pacing of the later footage. The final film carries both voices layered atop one another, creating a fractured rhythm that feels strangely fitting. Silver Bullet may tell the story of a beast tearing through a town, but behind the camera, the first real casualty was the vision that never had time to finish growing. FACT-8. Among the many mysteries buried in Silver Bullet's production is a sequence almost no one outside the crew has ever witnessed a scene filmed and then discarded before the movie reached theaters. It was conceived as a portrait of the town's psychological unraveling, a gathering where fear turned neighbor against neighbor long before the werewolf revealed itself. There were no special effects, no attacks, just the quiet brutality of suspicion. The cast included dozens of locals and extras instructed to whisper improvised lines about missing animals, strange footprints, and unsettling sounds carried on the wind. The preacher delivered a sermon not of comfort, but of warning, his voice cracking as though he sensed something rotting at the community's core. Crew members later described the footage as suffocating, charged with a tension that made the supernatural horror feel secondary. But the studio found the scene too accusatory, worried it would shift the film away from creature thrills and into a darker commentary about human frailty. They ordered it removed. The footage was boxed, mislabeled, and eventually lost to time, its existence surviving only through anecdotes from those who filmed it. What remains on screen is a simpler version of the town, frightened but innocent. The lost scene suggests something more unsettling, that the werewolf wasn't the only thing turning people against each other. FACT-9. One of the most ambitious ideas conceived for Silver Bullet was a transformation sequence meant to stand among the iconic metamorphoses of the decade. The effects team imagined a harrowing display of bones, shifting muscles, recoiling, and skin pulling tight as Reverend Lowe succumbed to the curse. They sketched elaborate stages of the transformation, each more grotesque than the last, and planned to blend practical makeup, animatronic rigs, and stop-motion techniques into a single fluid progression. Reality had other plans. Animatronic components jammed mid-motion. Prosthetic bladders inflated unevenly or burst during tests. Early stop-motion elements looked striking but clashed too dramatically with the live-action footage. Each attempt revealed a new flaw, a new limitation, a new reason to abandon what should have been the film's defining spectacle. After losing precious days, the studio demanded the sequence be stripped down. What survived was a minimalist approach, crossfades, lighting tricks, and strategic framing. It conveyed the idea of transformation without ever showing its brutality. To many viewers, the simplicity felt underwhelming. But hidden in production archives were photos of half-finished creature forms, limbs twisted at impossible angles, skin stretched across sharp bone structures, faces caught between man and monster. The transformation Silver Bullet delivered was subdued. The transformation it almost delivered was unforgettable. FACT-10. Long before audiences heard the werewolf's presence, Silver Bullet's sound designers attempted something bold, something that blurred the boundary between horror and grief. Their initial concept for the creature's voice involved weaving subtle layers of human suffering beneath the animalistic growls. Not screams or theatrical wails, but quiet, involuntary breaths recorded during controlled stress tests, gasps, strained inhalations, and muffled throat vibrations. The goal was simple, but daring, to create a sound that felt instinctively wrong, as if a trapped consciousness were still fighting inside the beast. Early mixes were unsettling in a way the studio hadn't anticipated. The growls carried an emotional tremor, a quiver that evoked torment rather than savagery. Test listeners described feeling unexpected sadness during otherwise violent scenes. Producers grew uneasy. They feared the human undertones made the creature too disturbing, too psychologically invasive for mainstream horror. They insisted the team strip away the human elements and rely on more conventional animal recordings. But complete erasure proved impossible. In several quiet moments of the final film, faint traces of those original breaths remain hidden beneath layers of sound, almost subconscious. When the werewolf lurks in shadow, the soft rise and fall of a human-like exhale flickers through the mix. Most viewers never notice it. Those who do often describe the sensation of hearing something wounded, not monstrous. The film never acknowledges this buried sorrow. But if you listen closely, you can still hear the man inside the beast trying to breathe. FACT-11. Silver Bullet's atmospheric identity. The heavy fog curling through the forest, the shimmering moonlight cutting through darkness, wasn't the result of planning, but of a technical breakdown. During one of the earliest night shoots, the fog machines malfunctioned and released an overwhelming torrent of vapor. The woods vanished behind a solid wall of mist. Crew members panicked, assuming the footage was ruined before the first take even finished. Yet when the director reviewed the test playback, he saw something no one expected. The excessive fog gave the forest a dreamlike distortion. Trees appeared and disappeared in slow waves, shadows drifted as if alive, and the werewolf silhouette seemed more threatening when glimpsed in fragments rather than shown fully. The mistake created an accidental visual poetry, a world where shapes dissolved and reformed, mirroring the monster's own fractured identity. Recognizing the potential, the director ordered a controlled replication of the effect during subsequent shoots. Fog became an intentional storytelling tool, not just a visual flourish. It masked the limitations of the creature suit, amplified tension, and transformed ordinary spaces into surreal landscapes where danger could materialize from any patch of darkness. Producers weren't thrilled. Some argued the fog obscured too much detail, others worried it made scenes look inconsistent. But the choice stayed. And today, the swirling mist is one of Silver Bullet's defining visual signatures. What began as a breakdown became the language of the film's fear. FACT-12. Editing Silver Bullet was less an assembly process and more a rescue mission. By the time all footage was collected, the film existed as a collage of conflicting tones: quiet dread, chaotic action, introspective drama, and conventional monster thrills. The editor faced the nearly impossible task of weaving these fragments into a coherent experience. He later described the footage as a puzzle missing pieces, with extra pieces from a different puzzle mixed in. To tame the chaos, he developed an unusual method. Instead of organizing clips by scene or script order, he arranged them by emotional temperature. Scenes were sorted into categories: cold tension, rising panic, melancholy, suspicion. This emotional grid became the backbone of the film's final structure. Where dialogue did not match, he bridged gaps with silence. Where tone shifted abruptly, he used long fades or held reaction shots a beat longer than expected. In moments where nothing aligned, he leaned on darkness, letting shadow do the work that storyboards no longer could. But he also refused to erase all inconsistencies. A few sudden tonal shifts were allowed to remain untouched. He believed they mirrored the narrative's psychological core, the instability of a town unraveling under unseen threat. Though the studio wanted a smoother flow, the editor argued that horror is strongest when the viewer is unsure what emotional rhythm to trust. His approach worked. The film's uneasy pacing wasn't a flaw. It was the echo of a production fighting itself frame by frame. FACT-13. The railway bridge that appears in Silver Bullet carries a quiet darkness that never made it into the script, but was deeply felt by the crew filming there. Long before production locals spoke in hushed tones about strange accidents that seemed to occur only near that stretch of track stories of hikers who vanished without explanation, of late-night joggers hearing something moving along the beams above them, of shadows that clung to the underside of the bridge even when the moon was bright. Most dismissed these tales as superstition, but once filming began, the atmosphere shifted. Crew members reported hearing footsteps echoing across the metal even when no one was on the structure. Tools went missing and were later found neatly placed in spots no one recalled using. During one lighting rehearsal, a spotlight drifted upward as if pulled by an unseen hand, revealing a vague, crouched outline beneath the rails. When the light steadied, the shape had already dissolved into the dark. No one could explain the movement. Even seasoned technicians felt a coldness that seemed to seep from the steel itself. Corey Haim, normally energetic between takes, refused to stand near the riverbank after claiming he heard low breathing behind him, steady, deliberate, too heavy to be the wind. Whether real or imagined, the discomfort grew strong enough that the bridge scenes were finished quickly, almost urgently, as though the crew wanted to leave before the place decided to share more of its secrets. Silver Bullet is fiction, but the fear the bridge inspired wasn't. FAE CT-14. Everett McGill's performance as Reverend Lowe carries a controlled intensity that feels unsettling even decades later. What the film never reveals is how deeply McGill submerged himself into the character's fractured psyche. Rather than playing the Reverend as a simple antagonist, he constructed a private emotional architecture around him, a man convinced that his violence served a twisted form of righteousness. To maintain this mindset, McGill distanced himself from the cast, rarely speaking casually and moving with a restraint that felt rehearsed yet fragile. He kept a handwritten journal in the Reverend's voice, filled with confessions and half-prayers written in calm, looping script. Crew members who glimpsed its pages described them as too intimate, the kind of writing that made the boundaries between character and actor feel blurred. On set, McGill avoided making eye contact with Corey Haim, explaining quietly that the predator should not acknowledge the innocents it hunts, not until the story forced the moment upon them. During filming of the final confrontation, something unexpected happened. McGill allowed a flicker of genuine sorrow to appear in the Reverend's expression, a split-second tremor that wasn't scripted. The director kept it. That brief sadness, barely noticeable, yet impossible to ignore, added a tragic dimension to the character that was never formally discussed. It suggested a man aware of his own damnation, mourning what he had become even as the beast took control. McGill didn't just play the monster, he played the man trapped beneath it. FACT-15. Before the production settled on the final creature design, Stephen King provided a series of rough storyboard sketches outlining how he believed the werewolf should emotionally resonate. These drawings were nothing like the bulky, bear-like creature audiences eventually saw. Instead, King envisioned a gaunt figure more human than wolf, with elongated limbs and a posture that suggested pain rather than rage. Its eyes were hollow, not predatory, an embodiment of guilt, walking on two legs. One sketch showed the creature standing at the threshold of a church, shoulders hunched as though burdened by invisible weight. Another depicted it curled in a corner, neither fully animal nor fully man, caught in the agony of a transformation it never wanted. King's intention was to make the monster a reflection of spiritual collapse, a creature horrifying not because of its violence, but because of what it revealed about the soul enduring it. The studio rejected the concept immediately. They feared such a design would be too abstract, too metaphorical, too literary for mainstream horror. They pushed instead for a more conventional creature, recognizable, marketable, straightforward. King's sketches were tucked away, then forgotten. Years later, a handful resurfaced, revealing a version of Silver Bullet that might have been deeply psychological, a story about a man whose monstrous form mirrored the ruin inside him. The final creature may have satisfied commercial expectations, but King's early drawings hinted at a far more haunting tale. The monster he imagined wasn't designed to scare the audience. It was designed to break their hearts. FACT 16. A small detail in Silver Bullet that most viewers never question, Reverend Loa's pendant was originally meant to carry far greater significance. In early drafts, the pendant wasn't just a religious ornament. It was intended to serve as an unspoken confession. The first version of the prop featured a tiny Latin engraving etched into its surface. Under bright light, it read, Silentium sub plena luna, meaning silence under the full moon. It was the Reverend's quiet acknowledgement that something divine had turned its back on him. During early filming, several close-up shots displayed the inscription clearly. Stephen King reportedly appreciated the somber symbolism, believing it deepened the character's inner torment. But when producers reviewed the footage, they quickly rejected the idea. They claimed the engraved message was too direct, too philosophical, and risked shifting the film toward religious commentary. Overnight, they demanded the pendant be replaced with a plain one. Continuity instantly became a nightmare. Scenes featuring the original pendant had to be reframed, trimmed, or discarded. Some shots linger just long enough for a hint of engraving to catch the light, fleeting, but unmistakable, like a ghost of the symbolism the film almost embraced. Most viewers never notice these tiny flashes, but once you do, you start to see the Reverend's story in a different shade of tragedy. The pendant was meant to expose the weight he carried. Now, it only hints at a truth the film tried to bury. FACT 17. The motorized wheelchair known as the Silver Bullet became a symbol of youthful defiance on screen. But behind the scenes, it was one of the most unpredictable and dangerous props on set. Designed to reflect Marty's determination and independence, the machine was built with a modified engine far more powerful than the production initially realized. During its first mobility test, it accelerated so quickly that the stunt performer nearly lost control, skidding across gravel and stopping inches from a lighting stand. Attempts to tame the machine didn't go smoothly. The brakes worked inconsistently on damp ground, and the steering tightened unpredictably at high speed. Crew members began treating the prop less like a mobility device and more like a small vehicle capable of doing real damage. Despite the risks, the chair was essential to several key scenes, meaning it had to be used carefully and with constant supervision. The closest call occurred during a break when Corey Haim climbed onto the chair out of curiosity. Without warning, the engine surged, sending him hurtling forward toward the riverbank. A nearby grip lunged and grabbed the back of the seat, stopping it just in time. Haim was shaken. The crew was terrified. From that moment on, the Silver Bullet was kept under lock and key, guarded with the same caution they'd use for pyrotechnics. On screen, the machine symbolizes courage. Off screen, it was the one thing everyone feared might outrun them. FACT 18. Late into production, a strange electrical event occurred in the forest that left the crew unsettled long after the lights were repaired. The team had prepared a carefully orchestrated lighting setup, generators, humming steadily, gels arranged to mimic moonlight, and several spotlights positioned to carve beams through the trees. As the crew prepared for the first take of the night, the lights suddenly flickered, not randomly, but in a slow, rhythmic pulse. 3 distinct flashes perfectly timed. Bright. Dark. Bright. Dark. Bright. Then stillness. Before anyone could react, one of the smaller spotlights burst with a crack that echoed through the trees. Glass scattered across the leaves. But the generators continued running without fluctuations. The wiring was dry and no equipment appeared faulty. Electricians checked every cable twice. No explanation emerged. Several crew members later claimed they heard something moving beyond the tree line during the blackout, a deliberate heavy shifting, as if something large repositioned itself just inside the darkness. Others dismissed this as nerves amplified by exhaustion and the eerie silence that followed the failure. Oddly enough, the footage shot after the incident captured a quality of light that didn't appear earlier in the night. Shadows seemed to curl more sharply, and the fog drifted with an unnatural slowness, as though something unseen lingered between the trees. The eerie glow in the final cut wasn't created by filters or post-production tricks. It came from the atmosphere that descended right after the lights went out. Technical glitch or something stranger, the forest never felt the same again. FAC T19.
Silver Bullet's musical identity almost became something far more unsettling than what audiences ultimately heard.
Composer Jay Chataway initially crafted a score steeped in unease, a tapestry of fractured strings, warped metallic tones, and subtle pulses meant to echo the werewolf's fractured humanity. Early demos incorporated distorted recordings of wind instruments played at unnatural tempos, along with experimental sounds created by bowing metal sheets to generate a low, trembling resonance. The music felt less like a soundtrack and more like a warning. When the studio reviewed these early compositions, they reacted with visible discomfort. Executives claimed the music sounded too oppressive, insisting it risked overwhelming scenes that required emotional clarity rather than existential dread. They requested something more uplifting, especially for Marty's storyline, pushing Chataway to reshape the score into a hybrid of dark atmosphere and melodic accessibility. But remnants of the abandoned version refused to disappear. Beneath several cues in the final film, faint vibrations linger, distant metal groans, uneven percussive taps, and trembling harmonics that feel almost accidental. Sound engineers later admitted they were leftovers from earlier mixes unnoticed by the studio but intentionally preserved for their emotional weight. These hidden textures lend the final score an undercurrent of tension that viewers often feel without consciously recognizing. The music that survived was a compromise. The music underneath it is the film's true heartbeat. FACT20. One of the most consequential editorial changes to Silver Bullet came from a decision that altered the film's thematic structure, revealing the werewolf's human identity far earlier than originally planned. Stephen King's script relied on suspicion and doubt, positioning the narrative as a slow tightening of psychological screws. Several characters were meant to appear guilty, each framed in ways that encouraged the audience to question their innocence. The revelation of Reverend Loa's curse was supposed to land late, sharp, shocking, and transformative. But test audiences reacted differently. Instead of appreciating the slow burn, they expressed frustration, interpreting the ambiguity as a pacing issue. The studio responded quickly, instructing editors to restructure the film. Scenes were reordered, foreshadowing was made more explicit, and the Reverend's identity became clear long before the third act. This shift fundamentally changed the narrative dynamic. Instead of a mystery, Silver Bullet became a story about denial, how a community fails to see danger even when it stands directly in front of them. The early reveal had an unintended effect. It made the Reverend a more tragic figure. Once viewers knew the truth, every scene featuring him carried an extra layer of tension. His smiles felt forced, his sermons hollow, his moments of hesitation heavy with dread. The film gained a quiet fatalism, as if everyone, audience included, were waiting for a man already doomed to collapse under the weight of his secret. It wasn't the Mystery King imagined, but it created a different kind of horror knowing the truth long before anyone else is willing to look at it. BONUSFACT. In the final week of production, the filmmakers shot an ending that has since slipped into near mythology. An ending that, had it survived, would have shifted Silver Bullet from a tale of victory into something far more unsettling. This alternate conclusion unfolded in near silence. Instead of jubilant relief after the final confrontation, the scene opened with Marty waking in a dimly lit room, listening to the stillness pressing against the walls. The house felt heavy, as if holding its breath. Jane stood in the doorway, her face half covered by moonlight. She didn't rush to him. She didn't speak. She simply watched, her expression unreadable, neither fear nor relief, but something in between, something unspoken. Marty asked if it was truly over, if the nightmare was finished. The camera lingered on Jane's eyes, waiting for her answer. But none came. She lowered her gaze slowly, as though considering a truth she couldn't bring herself to admit. The frame tightened on her face, catching a flicker of uncertainty or recognition. Before she could speak, the screen was meant to fade into darkness, leaving audiences to wonder what exactly she saw in herself in that moment. The implication was subtle but unmistakable. The curse did not die with the Reverend. Something had passed on. Something quiet. Something patient. Stephen King reportedly admired the ambiguity, saying the ending let the story keep breathing after the screen went black. But the studio rejected it immediately, calling it too bleak, too unresolved, too dangerous. They wanted closure, not a lingering shadow. Only a few still photographs and a few seconds of raw, silent footage remain from that abandoned ending. In them, Jane's expression carries a depth the final film never touches, a look suggesting that survival does not always mean escape. Sometimes evil doesn't vanish. Sometimes it simply waits for a new shape to take. Silver Bullet may seem like a straightforward creature tale, but the closer you look, the more you realize how many shadows lie beneath its surface. Its production was shaped by conflict, compromise, and strange moments no script ever anticipated. Every abandoned idea, every troubled decision, every eerie coincidence left its trace on the final film. What survives today is a story built not just from intention, but from the chaos that unfolded behind the scenes. Tell us in the comments which hidden truth altered the way you see the film, and whether you believe the nightmare truly ended or simply found a quieter place to wait.